Welcome to this journey into the forgotten shadows of American history. I'm your host, and tonight we delve into a case so deeply buried that even its existence was denied for over a century. Before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Drop a comment below. There's something uniquely unsettling about discovering these stories late at night, when the world is quiet and the past feels closer than it should. This is the story of Sarah Mae Whitfield, a 19-year-old woman who vanished without a trace in the spring of 1865, not as a victim of war, but as a calculated sacrifice. Her disappearance was not investigated, it was orchestrated, and for reasons that remain chilling to this day, every official record of what happened to her was systematically destroyed. The American Civil War had just ended. Virginia lay in ruins. The Confederacy had fallen, and the victorious Union forces were sweeping through the South, hunting down rebel sympathizers, confiscating property, and stamping out any remaining sparks of insurrection. In this chaos, in the remote countryside of Albemarle County, the Whitfield family found themselves at the center of a storm they could not escape. Colonel Thomas Whitfield, a former Confederate officer, had retreated to his family estate after the surrender at Appomattox. He was a broken man, his cause lost, his fortune crumbling. But what the Union forces discovered on his property was far more dangerous than a defeated soldier. They found evidence of conspiracy, letters, plans, whispers of a final, desperate revolt. The punishment for such treason was execution, not just for Thomas, but potentially for his entire family. His wife Eleanor, his 3 sons, and his only daughter Sarah Mae. But then, something strange happened. The executions never came. The Whitfield estate was not burned. The family was not arrested. Instead, a quiet agreement was reached behind closed doors, witnessed only by a handful of men who would take the secret to their graves. Sarah Mae Whitfield was seen for the last time on April 28, 1865, standing in the doorway of her family home, dressed in a plain grey dress, her face pale and expressionless. She carried nothing. She said nothing. She simply walked into a military carriage and disappeared into history. No trial, no record, no grave. What happened to Sarah Mae Whitfield? And why was her sacrifice necessary to prevent something far worse? The answers, if they exist at all, lie buried in fragments of letters, scorched documents, and the fading memories of those who knew but refused to speak. This is the forgotten case of the young woman silently given away to prevent a revolt. To understand what happened to Sarah Mae Whitfield, we must first understand the Virginia she lived in. The spring of 1865 was not a time of celebration in the South. It was a time of terror, confusion, and profound uncertainty. The Civil War had ended on April 9th with General Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, but the South was far from pacified. Albemarle County, where the Whitfield estate stood, was a landscape of devastation. Fields that once grew tobacco and corn were now scarred by artillery. Grand plantation houses had been ransacked or burned. Families who had once held power and wealth found themselves destitute overnight. The enslaved people who had worked their lands were now free, but freedom came without resources, protection, or clear direction. The entire social order had collapsed. Into this chaos came the Union occupation forces. These were not the disciplined armies of the war years, but rather a patchwork of units tasked with maintaining order, hunting down remaining Confederate loyalists, and preventing the kind of guerrilla resistance that had plagued other occupied territories. Tensions were high, revenge was in the air, and paranoia gripped both sides. The Whitfield family had deep roots in Virginia aristocracy. Colonel Thomas Whitfield had served with distinction in the Confederate cavalry, commanding a regiment that had fought in some of the war's bloodiest battles. He was not a political ideologue, by most accounts, but a man of loyalty and tradition. When Virginia seceded, he followed. When the Confederacy called, he answered. By 1865, however, Thomas Whitfield was no longer a soldier. He was a survivor, trying to protect what remained of his family. His wife, Eleanor, came from old Virginia money. She was educated, deeply religious, and by all accounts, the moral center of the household. Their 3 sons, ranging in age from 14 to 22, had all been too young or too injured to serve in the final years of the war. And then there was Sarah Mae. Sarah was the youngest child and the only daughter. Born in 1846, she had grown up in a world of privilege that was now collapsing around her. Those who knew her described her as quiet, obedient, deeply attached to her family. She read extensively, played piano, and attended church every Sunday without fail. She was, by the standards of her time and place, an ideal Southern daughter. But Sarah was also something else. She was observant. She kept a diary, meticulously recording the events of her life, the conversations she overheard, the fears she witnessed. That diary would become one of the few surviving clues to what really happened in the spring of 1865. In late April, Union forces arrived at the Whitfield estate. They were led by Major William Crane, an officer known for his ruthless efficiency in rooting out Confederate sympathizers. Crane had received intelligence, the nature of which remains unclear, that the Whitfield property was being used as a meeting place for former Confederate officers planning a final act of resistance. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Letters had been intercepted, names had been mentioned, and when Union soldiers searched the estate, they found hidden compartments containing weapons, Confederate currency, and documents that suggested ongoing communication with other rebel families in the region. Under the military law of the time, this was treason. The penalty was death. But Major Crane did not immediately arrest the family. Instead, he called for a private meeting with Colonel Whitfield. What was discussed in that meeting was never officially recorded. But what happened next would haunt the region for generations. According to later testimony from a house servant named Rebecca, who remained on the property after emancipation, the meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. Voices were raised. At one point, Eleanor Whitfield was called into the room, and then, shortly before nightfall, Sarah Mae was summoned. Rebecca later recalled seeing Sarah walk down the main staircase of the house with a blank expression on her face. Her mother was weeping. Her father stood rigid, his jaw clenched. The Union soldiers waited by the front door. And then, without ceremony, without explanation, Sarah walked out of the house and into a covered military carriage. She never returned. The Whitfield family was not arrested. Their property was not confiscated. The weapons and documents were removed, but no charges were filed. It was as if a transaction had occurred and the matter was considered closed. But closed for whom? And at what cost? The local community watched in confused silence. No one dared ask questions. No one dared speak Sarah's name. The Whitfield family themselves retreated into isolation, rarely leaving their estate, rarely speaking to neighbors. When asked about Sarah, they would only say she had gone away. Where? To whom? For how long? No answers were given. This silence, enforced by fear and shame, would last for decades. The first real evidence that something deeply wrong had occurred did not surface until 1890, 25 years after Sarah's disappearance. It came in the form of a letter discovered in the attic of a former Union officer's home in Massachusetts. The officer, Captain Edmund Hale, had served under Major William Crane during the occupation of Virginia. After the war, Hale returned to civilian life and rarely spoke of his service. When he died in 1889, his widow began sorting through his belongings and found a small wooden box hidden beneath floorboards. Inside was a collection of letters, most of them routine military correspondence. But one letter, dated May 3rd, 1865, stood out. It was written by Major Crane to Captain Hale and marked "Confidential, destroy after reading." Captain Hale had not destroyed it. The letter read, in part, "The matter of the Whitfield girl has been resolved as discussed. She has been transferred to the facility at Point Lookout under the designation of a political detainee. No formal charges have been filed, and no record will be entered into the public register. Colonel Whitfield has agreed to full cooperation in exchange for clemency for his sons and the preservation of his property. The girl is to remain indefinitely under military supervision. Her silence is guaranteed." This letter, now housed in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society, was the first official confirmation that Sarah Mae Whitfield had not simply gone away. She had been taken into military custody. But for what purpose? And what did "her silence is guaranteed" mean? Point Lookout, located in Maryland, was one of the largest Union prison camps during the Civil War. It held Confederate soldiers under brutal conditions, but by May 1865, the war was over. The prison was being decommissioned. So where exactly was Sarah taken? And under what authority could a young woman with no criminal charges be detained indefinitely? Historians who later investigated the case discovered fragmentary references to a separate facility associated with Point Lookout that was never officially documented. It was referred to in private letters and unofficial reports as the Annex or the Women's Ward. Its purpose remains unclear, but evidence suggests it housed women deemed politically dangerous or socially inconvenient by military authorities during the chaotic period of Reconstruction. These were not criminals in the legal sense. They were women who knew too much, who were related to the wrong people, or who had become liabilities to be quietly removed. No trials, no records, just disappearance. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Do you believe Sarah was a genuine threat, or was she simply a pawn sacrificed to save her family? Your theories matter as we continue this investigation. In 1892, a journalist named Margaret Hartley began researching cases of missing women from the Civil War era for a series she was writing on forgotten victims of the conflict. When she came across the Whitfield case, she traveled to Virginia to interview surviving family members and locals who remembered the events of 1865. What she found disturbed her deeply. The Whitfield estate was still standing but in decay. Colonel Thomas Whitfield had died in 1878, reportedly having never spoken his daughter's name again. Eleanor Whitfield had died just 2 years later, some said of a broken heart. The 3 sons had scattered, leaving Virginia and changing their names. None would agree to speak with Hartley, but Rebecca, the former servant, was still alive and living in a small cabin near the old estate. She was in her 70s by then, frail but sharp-minded, and she was finally willing to talk. Rebecca told Hartley that on the night Sarah was taken, she had been ordered to pack a small bag for the girl. Just necessities, she was told. Nothing personal, no letters, no books, no jewelry. Rebecca remembered Sarah standing in her bedroom, staring out the window at the soldiers waiting below. She asked Rebecca a single question. "Will they kill me?" Rebecca said she didn't know how to answer. She lied. She said no. But Sarah just nodded slowly, as if she knew the truth was far more complicated. Rebecca also revealed something else. In the days before the Union soldiers arrived, she had seen Sarah burning papers in the fireplace of her room. Not just any papers. Pages torn from her diary. Sarah was destroying her own words, her own thoughts, as if she knew they could be used against her or her family. But Sarah had not burned everything. Rebecca had found a few loose pages that had fallen behind a dresser. She had kept them hidden all these years, afraid to show them to anyone. She gave them to Margaret Hartley. The pages were fragmentary, damaged by time, but what remained was chilling. In one entry, dated April 15, 1865, just days after Lee's surrender, Sarah wrote, "Father met with Colonel Morrison and Mr. Danvers again tonight. They speak of honor and resistance. I do not understand their plans fully, but I fear what they intend. Mother prays constantly. I hear her weeping in the chapel. She knows something terrible is coming. I feel it too. There is no future here for any of us, only choices that will haunt us forever." Another fragment, undated, read, "If I am to be the price, then let it be so. Better one than all. Father will not say it, but I see it in his eyes. He has already decided. Mother cannot bear to look at me. I am already a ghost in this house." These words suggested that Sarah knew, or at least suspected, that she would be offered as some kind of bargaining chip. But they also raised more questions. What exactly were Colonel Morrison and Mr. Danvers planning? Who were they? And did Sarah's sacrifice actually prevent a violent uprising? Or was it simply a convenient excuse to remove a witness to something far darker? Margaret Hartley published her findings in 1893 in a Boston newspaper. The story caused a brief sensation but was quickly dismissed by Southern historians as Yankee propaganda meant to further humiliate the defeated Confederacy. No official investigation was launched. The Whitfield case was once again buried, but the fragments Sarah left behind, the letters that had escaped destruction, and the testimonies of those who remembered would continue to surface piece by piece over the next century. Each new discovery only deepened the mystery, and the most disturbing revelations were still to come. In 1921, a historian named Dr. Edwin Thorpe was conducting research on Civil War prison camps for a book he was writing. While examining archives at the Library of Congress, he came across a box of uncatalogued photographs from the 1860s. Most were standard military images, camps, officers, regiments, but mixed among them were several disturbing photographs that appeared to have no clear origin or context. One photograph in particular caught his attention. It showed a woman standing against a brick wall, dressed in what appeared to be a prisoner's uniform, a shapeless grey dress, no shoes, her hair roughly cut short. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow. She stared directly at the camera with an expression that Thorpe later described as beyond despair, beyond hope, beyond anything recognizably human. On the back of the photograph, written in faded pencil, were 3 words: "Point Lookout, 1866, female." Thorpe was confused. Point Lookout had officially closed in 1865. Why would there be a photograph of a female prisoner there in 1866? He began digging deeper into military records, looking for any mention of women being held at the facility. What he found were inconsistencies, redactions, and pages that had been deliberately removed from official logs. One document, a quartermaster's report from late 1865, mentioned provisions for 18 individuals in auxiliary holding, 18, but official records showed the main prison had been emptied by then. Who were these 18 individuals, and where exactly were they being held? Thorpe travelled to Point Lookout, which by 1921 was nothing but ruins and overgrown fields. Local residents told him stories passed down through generations about the women who screamed at night during the years after the war, about a section of the camp that was kept separate, hidden behind walls, where civilians were never allowed to go, about bodies buried in unmarked graves in the woods nearby. Thorpe hired workers to excavate areas where locals claimed graves might exist. What they found confirmed the worst suspicions: shallow graves, no coffins, remains that suggested hurried burials. And among the remains, small personal effects: a button with a Confederate emblem, a fragment of a woman's shoe, a bone comb. But the most chilling discovery was a metal identification tag found near one of the graves. It was corroded and barely legible, but forensic experts were able to make out portions of the engraving. SMW, 1846, detainee. SMW, Sarah Mae Whitfield, born 1846, detainee. Could this be Sarah's grave? Thorpe believed it was, but without more definitive proof, without dental records or family DNA to compare. It remained speculation. And even if it was Sarah, the larger question remained: how did she die? And why was she buried here, nameless and forgotten, in a grave that was never supposed to be found? Thorpe published his findings in 1923 in an academic journal. The response was mixed. Some scholars praised his investigative work. Others accused him of sensationalism and fabricating evidence to sell books. The debate raged for years, but led to no official action. The graves at Point Lookout were eventually covered over again, and the site was designated as protected federal land where further excavation was prohibited. The photograph of the woman, however, remained. It was archived, preserved. And as photographic analysis technology improved over the decades, experts began to examine it more closely. In 1967, a forensic specialist compared the photograph to the only known image of Sarah Mae Whitfield, a family portrait taken in 1863. The similarities were striking: bone structure, ear shape, distinctive features that are difficult to alter. The specialist concluded there was an 80% probability that the woman in the prison photograph was indeed Sarah Mae Whitfield. But if it was her, the photograph raised a new horror. It was dated 1866. That meant Sarah had survived in custody for at least a year after she was taken. What happened to her during that year? And if she died in 1866, why did certain documents suggest the facility remained in operation for years longer? In 1956, during the demolition of an old medical building in Baltimore that had served various military purposes over the decades, construction workers discovered a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside was a leather-bound journal belonging to Dr. Nathaniel Cross, a military surgeon who had worked at Point Lookout and several associated facilities during and after the Civil War. The journal covered the years 1864 to 1870 and contained detailed medical notes, observations, and personal reflections. Most entries were mundane professional records, but scattered throughout were passages that suggested Dr. Cross had been involved in something that deeply troubled his conscience. One entry from June 1865 read, "I have been assigned to oversee the medical needs of the Women's Annex. There are currently 14 women housed here, ranging in age from 17 to 43. None have been charged with crimes. All are designated as political detainees. I'm told my role is to ensure they remain healthy enough to be held indefinitely, but not to question the circumstances of their detention. This troubles me greatly. These women have no legal representation. They have no contact with family. Some have been here for months. When I asked Major Crane about the legal basis for their detention, I was told it was a matter of national security and not my concern." Another entry from August 1865 was more specific. A new girl arrived today, young, perhaps 19. She was brought in by military escort and placed in isolation cell number 7. She spoke very little. When I examined her for intake medical assessment, I noted she appeared to be in a state of profound shock. She answered questions mechanically. Name, Sarah. Place of origin. She hesitated, then said Virginia. When I asked if she had family, she said nothing at all, just stared at the wall. I asked the guard what she had done to be detained. Here, he told me she hadn't done anything. She was insurance against rebel activity in her region. This is not medicine. This is not justice. This is imprisonment without cause. Dr. Cross's journal entries over the following months painted a grim picture of life in the women's annex. The conditions were not as brutal as the main prison camp had been, but they were psychologically devastating. The women were kept in small cells, allowed minimal interaction with each other, given no information about when or if they would be released. They were not allowed to send or receive letters. They were not allowed visitors. They simply existed in limbo, their lives frozen. Dr. Cross noted that several of the women deteriorated mentally over time: depression, hysteria, catatonia. He treated them as best he could with the limited psychiatric understanding of the era, but he knew his efforts were futile. The real illness was their imprisonment itself. He wrote specifically about Sarah several times. In October 1865, "The girl from Virginia grows thinner. She barely eats. She does not resist. She does not protest. She simply fades day by day. I have never seen anything like it. It is as if she has decided to disappear from within." In January 1866, Sarah collapsed today during inspection, severe malnutrition and what I believe is pneumonia. I have requested she be transferred to the main medical ward for proper treatment. Request denied. I am to treat her in her cell. This is unconscionable. And then in March 1866, a final entry about Sarah. "The girl died this morning at approximately 4:15 a.m. Cause of death, respiratory failure secondary to pneumonia and prolonged malnutrition. She was conscious until the end. In her final moments, she asked me to tell her family she forgave them. I asked for what. She smiled weakly and said, 'For living.' I do not know what she meant. Her body will be buried in the auxiliary cemetery. No marker, no record, as if she never existed. I am complicit in this evil. God forgive me." Dr. Cross's journal was authenticated by historians and medical experts. It is now housed at the National Archives. It remains one of the most damning pieces of evidence about the treatment of civilian detainees during the Reconstruction era. But it also raised new questions. If Sarah died in March 1866, why were there later references to women still being held at the facility in 1868 and 1869? Were there others like Sarah? How many women passed through the annex? And what happened to those who survived? In 1978, a box of letters was donated to the Virginia Historical Society by the estate of a deceased minister's widow. Among them was a sealed envelope marked "To be opened only after my death." Inside was a handwritten confession by Reverend Josiah Marks, the minister who had served the Albemarle County community in 1865. Reverend Marks had died in 1902, but his confession had remained sealed for 76 years, as per his instructions. What it revealed was the final piece of the puzzle regarding what led to Sarah's sacrifice. According to Reverend Marks, in April 1865, he had been present at a secret meeting at the Whitfield estate. Colonel Thomas Whitfield, along with two other former Confederate officers, had indeed been planning a final act of resistance. Not a full-scale rebellion, but a coordinated series of attacks on Union supply lines and administrative offices in several Virginia counties. The goal was not to reverse the war's outcome, which they knew was impossible, but to send a message that the South would not be easily subjugated. Reverend Marks had been invited to the meeting to offer moral guidance. He had argued strenuously against the plan. He told them it was suicide, that it would bring destruction not just to them, but to their families and their community, that the war was over and revenge was not the same as honor. But the men were determined. They believed history would judge them, cowardly if they did not resist. And they had recruited others. The conspiracy involved at least 20 men across 3 counties. Then came the devastating blow. Someone had informed the Union authorities. Whether it was a servant, a neighbor, or one of the conspirators who lost his nerve, The information reached Major Crane within days, and Crane moved swiftly. He arrived at the Whitfield estate with enough evidence to hang everyone involved. But Crane was not interested in creating martyrs. He was interested in stability. Public executions of prominent Southern families would only inflame tensions and potentially inspire the very resistance he was trying to prevent. So he offered Colonel Whitfield a deal. The conspiracy would be buried. No arrests, no executions, but Whitfield would have to provide something in return, something that would guarantee his continued cooperation and ensure his silence, something that would hurt enough to keep him in line forever. A hostage, a guarantee, a life in exchange for lives. Reverend Marks wrote, "Thomas Whitfield was a proud man, but he was not a monster. The choice destroyed him. I watched him age 10 years in a single night, but he believed he had no alternative. If he refused, all 3 of his sons would hang alongside him. His wife would be left destitute. The estate would be burned. By sacrificing Sarah, he could save everyone else. It was, in his mind, a father's terrible duty." Eleanor begged him to refuse. She said, "They should all face death together rather than commit such a sin." But Thomas would not relent, and Sarah, God help her, agreed to go. She said if her brothers could live, if her mother could be spared, then her life had purpose. I have never witnessed such courage or such tragedy. I gave her final communion before she left. She asked me to pray not for her soul, but for her father's. She knew he would never forgive himself, and she was right. He died a broken man, haunted until his last breath. The Reverend's confession explained the why, but it did not absolve anyone. It simply revealed the impossible choice that had been made, and the human cost of that choice. Sarah Mae Whitfield had not been arrested for any crime. She had not been a threat. She had simply been available, young and female, which made her both vulnerable and valuable as a bargaining chip. Her sacrifice had worked in a sense. There was no revolt. The conspiracy dissolved. The community remained relatively peaceful during Reconstruction, but the price was a young woman's life, taken quietly, buried without record, forgotten by history. Until now. The story of Sarah Mae Whitfield did not end with Dr. Cross's journal or Reverend Marks's confession. Throughout the 20th century, additional fragments continued to surface, each adding new dimensions to the tragedy. In 1952, a graduate student researching women's history at the University of Virginia conducted oral history interviews with elderly residents of Albemarle County. One woman, aged 94, claimed her grandmother had been a seamstress who occasionally worked at the Whitfield estate before the war. The grandmother had told stories about Sarah, describing her as a girl who read too much and understood too much. The seamstress believed Sarah had overheard the conspiracy plans and had kept detailed notes, making her a liability. Whether Sarah intended to inform on her father or simply recorded events for her own understanding was unclear, but the fact that she knew made her dangerous to both sides. The Union wanted her silenced to prevent her from becoming a rallying symbol for the resistance. Her own family needed her gone to prove their loyalty. In 1965, during the Civil War centennial, a local historian published a booklet about forgotten graves in Virginia. It included a reference to an unmarked grave on the former Whitfield estate property, which by then had been subdivided and sold to different owners. The current owner reported that in the 1930s, workers digging a foundation for a new barn had discovered a small grave containing what appeared to be personal effects: a silver locket, a book of psalms, and a piece of paper with a single sentence written in faded ink, "Forgive me, my daughter, I chose wrong." The handwriting was later analyzed and matched to samples of Colonel Thomas Whitfield's writing. It suggested that after Sarah was taken, possibly after learning of her death, Thomas had created a memorial grave on his property, even though her body was not there. It was his private act of penance, hidden from everyone, maintained in secret until his own death. In 1983, a researcher combing through Maryland state records found a payment voucher from 1867 for maintenance of auxiliary federal facilities, Point Lookout region. The amount was for the care of 12 female political detainees. This was 2 years after the main prison had closed and a year after Sarah's recorded death. It suggested that the women's annex had continued to operate longer than anyone previously thought, and that Sarah had not been its only victim. Who were the other 11 women? Their names, if recorded at all, have never been found. They remain as anonymous as Sarah nearly became. The only difference is that Sarah's family left just enough traces, just enough guilt, just enough evidence for later generations to piece together what happened. In 1991, a documentary filmmaker attempted to create a film about the Whitfield case. She traveled to Point Lookout, interviewed historians, and obtained permission to use ground-penetrating radar to search for the unmarked graves Dr. Thorpe had found in 1921. The radar detected anomalies consistent with multiple burial sites, but when she applied for permits to excavate, her application was denied by federal authorities. The official reason given was environmental protection. But the filmmaker suspected the real reason was that the government did not want to officially acknowledge what had happened at the site. The documentary was never completed. The filmmaker ran out of funding and moved on to other projects. But the footage she shot, now archived at a university library, includes interviews with descendants of Union soldiers who had served under Major Crane. One descendant shared letters his great-great-grandfather had written home, including one from 1866 that mentioned the troublesome matter of the Southern, women who cannot be released and cannot be acknowledged. The letter suggested that by late 1865, the Union command realized they had created a problem with no clean solution. They had imprisoned women without legal authority, and releasing them would invite scrutiny and scandal, so they simply kept them hidden away until time and circumstance made the problem disappear. Most disturbingly, in 2003, a metal detector enthusiast searching fields near Point Lookout found a corroded metal box, buried about 3 feet underground. Inside were waterlogged papers, mostly illegible, but one fragment could be partially read. It appeared to be a list of names, dates, and locations. Among the names, S. Whitfield, Virginia, April 1865, term indefinite, status, deceased 3/12/66. The box was turned over to the National Archives. Experts were able to recover a few more fragments from other pages. They appeared to be intake records for the women's annex, listing not just names but also the reasons for detention. Sarah's entry included the notation, family insurance, high-value leverage, no release authorized. Other women on the list had similar notations: wife of suspected insurgent, retain until husband's compliance confirmed, sister of known rebel operative, hold as deterrent, witness to unauthorized military action, permanent detention required. These were not criminals. They were inconveniences. They were women whose freedom was less important than the political needs of the moment, and they were forgotten because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging a profound moral failure. The fragments from Point Lookout, the confession of Reverend Marks, the journal of Dr. Cross, the grave on the Whitfield property, and dozens of other small pieces of evidence now form a mosaic of tragedy. Each piece alone might be dismissed or questioned, but together they paint an undeniable picture of systematic abuse, institutional cruelty, and historical erasure. Sarah Mae Whitfield existed. She was taken. She died in captivity, and her story was deliberately buried because it was inconvenient for those in power to admit what had been done in the name of peace and stability. but the fragments remain, and they speak. So what really happened to Sarah Mae Whitfield? After examining all the available evidence, we are left with multiple theories, each supported by different pieces of the fragmentary record. Theory 1. Sarah died of natural causes in captivity. This is supported by Dr. Cross's journal, which describes her declining health and eventual death from pneumonia and malnutrition. If this is true, then Sarah was not murdered in a deliberate sense, but rather died from neglect and the conditions of her imprisonment. Her death would have been slow, documented, and preventable. It would make her captors guilty not of murder, but of something perhaps even more chilling: bureaucratic indifference to suffering. Theory 2. Sarah was executed after her usefulness as a hostage ended. Some researchers believe Dr. Cross's account may have been falsified or that he was deceived about Sarah's true fate. They point to inconsistencies in the timeline and suggest that once the threat of rebellion had fully passed, Sarah may have been quietly executed to eliminate any witness to the illegal detention program. The fact that no body was ever definitively identified and that records were so thoroughly destroyed suggests a cover-up more consistent with execution than natural death. Under this theory, Sarah knew too much about the conspiracy, about the deal her father made, and about the other women held at the facility. Her continued existence was a liability. Theory 3. Sarah survived and was released under a false identity. This is the most controversial theory, but it has some intriguing support. Several researchers have noted that the 1866 death date in Dr. Cross's journal doesn't align perfectly with other timeline references. There are unconfirmed reports of a woman matching Sarah's description appearing in Ohio in the early 1870s, living under the name Mary Sanders, who refused to discuss her past and had visible scars consistent with prolonged imprisonment. A photograph from 1872 shows a woman who bears a striking resemblance to Sarah, though aged and hardened by experience. If Sarah did survive, she may have been released on the condition that she never reveal what happened to her, never contact her family, and never return to Virginia. She would have lived the rest of her life as a ghost, erased from history just as effectively as if she had died. Each theory has its advocates. Each has evidence that supports it and gaps that undermine it. The truth, if it exists, remains buried somewhere in the spaces between documentation and silence. What we know for certain is this: in 1865, a 19-year-old woman was taken from her home without trial, without charge, without any legal process whatsoever. She was used as a bargaining chip in a political negotiation. She was imprisoned in a facility that officially didn't exist. And whether she died there, was killed there, or survived to live under a false identity, she was erased from the historical record as thoroughly as possible. Sarah Mae Whitfield's case was not unique. The fragmentary evidence suggests at least a dozen other women suffered similar fates during the chaotic years of Reconstruction. How many more were there whose stories left not even fragments behind? How many daughters, sisters, wives, and mothers were silently traded away to prevent revolts, secure compliance, or eliminate inconvenient witnesses? The Whitfield estate still stands, though it has been converted into apartments. The land where Union forces once camped is now a shopping center. Point Lookout is a state park where families picnic on warm summer days, unaware of the graves that may still lie beneath their feet. History has moved on. The living have forgotten, but the fragments remain in archives, in attics, in old journals and faded photographs. They wait to be discovered by those willing to look beyond the official narratives, beyond the sanitized versions of history that erase the uncomfortable truths. Sarah Mae Whitfield deserves to be remembered, not as a symbol, not as a political statement, but as a human being who faced an impossible situation with courage and dignity. A young woman who agreed to sacrifice herself so that her family might live. A daughter who understood she was the price of peace and paid it without resistance. To this day, no one knows the complete truth of what happened to her in those final months. No one knows if she died believing her sacrifice had meaning, or if she realized in those last moments that she had simply been discarded by a system that valued order over justice, stability over humanity. Her story is not about North versus South, Union versus Confederacy, or even right versus wrong. In the context of the Civil War, it is about power and what those who hold power are willing to do to maintain it. It is about the invisible victims of history, the ones who are erased not because their stories don't matter, but precisely because they matter too much. And so I ask you, what do you believe happened to Sarah Mae Whitfield? Do you think she died in that cell in 1866? Do you think she was executed? Or do you think, against all odds, she survived and lived out her days in quiet anonymity, carrying secrets she could never share? Leave your theories in the comments below. Share this story. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the forgotten shadows of history. We are building a community of truth seekers and history lovers, people who refuse to let these stories remain buried. Until next time, remember, history is written by the victors, but the truth is written in fragments, waiting for those brave enough to piece it together. This has been the forgotten case of the young woman silently given away to prevent a revolt. Thank you for watching, and remember, some silences speak louder than words.